Kenneth, history is not a fixed discipline. There are great debates that, have gone on for centuries, for millennia, and they continue today as we have new understandings of the past, new documents and source material that comes to light, new perspectives. And that's all part of a very healthy process. And to me, it's what makes the discipline so interesting. But at the same time, now we're contending with propaganda from this administration. And sometimes that debate can be mistaken for weakness. And it's very appealing for some people to just give a very cut and dried explanation of our history. America is perfect. It was made by perfect men. And now perhaps we have another perfect man in the White House, and that's all you need to understand. Can you talk with us a little bit about these debates within history and why they're so important, and yet how we can resist this kind of authoritarian impulse that we're seeing?
Wow, I wish I had a nice packaged answer to that question because it's critical. Certainly, I'm a little bit older than you, but I grew up in the 1960s and into the 70s. And certainly when I was in elementary school and maybe well into high school, we were still pretty much getting the what I call the bedtime narrative of history with George Washington couldn't tell a lie, and he crossed the Delaware, and Abraham Lincoln chopped down the wood and made timbers, and all that was great, and it was meant to make us proud and patriotic. And there's nothing wrong with pride and patriotism if it's based on reality. And I think we have a lot to be proud and patriotic about in this country's history. So that was the narrative, certainly, that I grew up with as a young boy. And certainly by the time I got into high school, and now we're talking about late 60s into the early 70s, the scholarship had changed significantly. First of all, many more Black scholars were getting into the conversation. More women scholars were getting into the conversation. And people were starting to look more closely and dig more deeply into this question of who these founders were, what they actually did, what America was like. And I certainly wrote Don't Know Much About History out of that context. I was none of my research is particularly original. I stand on the shoulders of extraordinary historians who brought these things to light. But there's always been a push and pull in history. There have always been waves of history. I think that for most of the past, let's say 50 or 60 years, the version that I talk about, the version in which slavery is a central piece of the American story, became the prominent one, and we recognized it. And certainly aided and abetted by people like Ken Burns, who produced the Civil War series, for instance, on PBS, which really directly related the history of the Civil War, as I do in many of my books, to the role of slavery in this great crisis that came about. And the men who wrote the Constitution, the men who also wrote the Declaration, feared that. They thought it was coming. They thought they had solved it in 1787 by passing a law that ended the international slave trade in 1808. That was a serious miscalculation. People like Washington and Jefferson both fretted about slavery. They thought it was wrong. They knew it was a contradiction to the ideals to which they were fighting for. Washington even writes to Robert Morris, his very, very wealthy Robert Morris, a signer of the Declaration, who later goes broke, that he's certain that these people will eventually be free. Part of the myth of Washington is that he freed all of his enslaved people in his will. He did not. He freed one person at the time of his death. That person was a man named Billy Lee. But most of the rest of the enslaved, more than 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon and his other plantations, were not to be emancipated until after Martha Washington's death. And even then, some of those people actually weren't in his control. They actually belonged to Martha Washington's first husband. They
Mm.
were called the dower slaves of the Custis estate, and they were going to go back into enslavement under the Custises. So these are very complicated ideas, but I've tried to always personalize them. I wrote a book called In the Shadow of Liberty that looks at 5 people who were enslaved by 4 of our most famous presidents, including Washington and Jefferson. And Billy Lee is one of them. Another is Ona Judge. We're talking about Philadelphia and Washington being president there. Young woman named Ona Judge. She was biracial, although black by all appearances. Her father had been a Scottish tailor who was an indentured servant at Mount Vernon and later disappears. Ona runs away from Washington on the 20th anniversary, about the 20th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1796. And Washington then spends the next 3 years using the powers of the presidency to try and track her down. It's an extraordinary human story about a woman who wanted what Washington wanted for himself and for his country, freedom and liberty. She wanted her freedom, and eventually wins it, although she was technically and legally still enslaved at the time of her death. She outlived Washington by more than 40 years. So it's quite an extraordinary story. But you can't, again, you can't separate that out from the picture that we have of George Washington. I never heard of Ona Judge and enslaved people running away from Washington while he was president when I was growing up. And it's a really important story that we should understand.